Navy Matters.
Hello, and thank you for joining me today. I'm your host, Richard Acritelli, and on today's episode of Fog of War and Humanity here on HMTV, my special guest is Lieutenant Dan Guida, who will speak about his experiences as an officer during the Vietnam War, serving in armor within the fight of this Southeast Asian conflict, and his unyielding efforts to always support veterans' causes and needs. Lieutenant Dan, here we go. Let's get started. Where did you grow up as a young man?
I grew up in an area called the Five Towns, which is in southern part of Nassau County, right near Kennedy Airport. I went to Lawrence High School. After high school, I spent a year working in construction. Then I tried college. I went to St. John's University for a year. By September of 65, I decided I wasn't ready for college, so I decided in September I wasn't going back to college. By October, I was taking my Army physical, and by February of that year, I was drafted into the service.
Now, what did you study in college, briefly there?
My father wanted me to be a pharmacist, so I was trying to do it, but I don't think I was really qualified to be a pharmacist at that time. So
okay.
I made it through a year, and I just wasn't ready. My grades weren't good, so I left college and almost immediately ended up in the service.
Did your dad or any members of your family have any military time or experience?
I have two brother-in-laws that were in the Korean War. On my mother's side, she had 9 brothers, and 5 of them were in Korea. And one of my aunts, her husband, was killed in one of the battles during World War II.
Wow! So there
was
strong family.
A strong family. We were very involved with the VFW and the American Legion. That was the part of the town. And
that was probably no different than any other town in Nassau County or towards Queens where you were also?
It was all the same like that. The VFW, the American Legion were the big organizations in town, and everybody kind of participated or went around it. That area was, I won't say it was pro-war, but it was more familiar with what was going on with the services.
Sure, you had really kind of the start of Vietnam, the Korean War, World War II, and then the global Cold War. You had some major conflicts within years of each other.
Yes, we did. And you look at your family, and you have one part of your family was in World War II, one part of your family was in Korea, and then all of a sudden one part of your family is in Vietnam. So it was a constant thing going on with military activity.
So almost this is now your turn.
My turn, yeah.
In terms of
finally my
family experience.
To get into this.
You leave college, you get drafted. Take me like the steps that you
what
took
happens
here.
is once you get drafted, the first thing you do in the Army anyway is you go to what's known as a reception station. This is a place where they take tests and see what you're qualified or what you wanted to do. I went down to Fort Jackson, South Carolina, and one of the tests I took qualified me for OCS, which is Officers Candidate School. I think maybe you've seen the movie Officer and a Gentleman with
Sure.
Richard Gere. Well, that's what Officers Candidate School was. From Fort Jackson, my first stop was in Fort Hood, Texas for basic training. Fort Hood, Texas had the first and second Armored Division, so I got my first test of armored vehicles, which is what I wanted to do when I went into the service.
So now you're a kid from the Five Towns, Woodmere, right?
Yes.
You end up in Fort Hood, Texas.
Yes.
You have a strong Italian last name.
Yes.
Probably a little bit of a Long Island accent, right?
Definitely I had a Brooklyn accent. Definitely a Brooklyn accent, and yes.
And there's probably a melting pot down there in terms of guys from all over the country.
It was funny. The unit that I went in, we got drafted. We went out of New York down here, and there were quite a few people from New York that were in that unit for their basic training. A lot of them stayed in that unit and eventually went to Germany. But with me going to OCS, I ended up on the other side.
Now, early on, did that make things a little bit easier for you? There was some of the accents that you could identify with?
It was kind of instant. You had people. I remember sitting there, and it was funny. One night I was sitting there, and one of the WABC came on the radio in Fort Hood, Texas, and you're sitting there listening to Murray the K or somebody else from all the way down in Fort Hood. So it was good. You had friends and everything else.
Now, what year was that?
This was 1966.
All right, so yeah, Vietnam is
starting to bake really hot, really heavy. From Fort Hood, I went to Fort Knox, Kentucky. Fort Knox, Kentucky is where I took what is known as AIT, Advanced Individual Training. That was my introduction to armored vehicles. After a period there, I completed the AIT.
Did you have a choice to go armor? Is that something they offered you?
They gave us choices.
Yeah.
I chose armor as my first choice, and I guess they needed them at that time, so I was able to go armor.
What was the reason behind armor?
It seemed exciting.
Exciting.
You know, I didn't want to be a grunt or running around in a foxhole or something. I figured I could ride my way through it, so I chose armor.
And that's the place to do. A lot of training there, right?
A lot of training. From the after AIT, I took OCS, and like I said, I was commissioned January of '67 as a second lieutenant. At that point, Uncle Sam decides to send me to Fort Lewis, Washington, where I spent the next 10 months pushing basic trainees. After that...
And you're as a second lieutenant
As a second lieutenant at that time. They called it a butter bar, because the golden bar was a golden bar that you were wearing, so they called us all gold.
Did that help you, like your attention to detail, to make sure that the recruits were doing what they needed to be doing?
Yes, it did. You know, the thing is, when I was there, I was fortunate. I had a number of NCOs, sergeants, who kind of took me under their wing, and I got the technical knowledge, but they were giving me all the experience. So I was able to gain some good help from these people because they helped me along. I didn't go there with a bullhead or anything like that. I wanted to learn, and they were there helping.
Now, you're training other recruits that are only maybe a year, 2 years, 3 years younger, if that.
They were, yeah.
What were the biggest success, but some of the hardest things that you might have had to do in terms of that type of training?
Well, you know, this was 66.
And that's leadership too, because you're an officer.
I was an officer. This is 66, 67, where the draft was flying. And you had a lot of people coming into the service that really weren't, shall we say, guided for the service. So it was a difficult thing at times. This was the West Coast. We had a lot of people from California and that area there, and they weren't exactly totally in tune to the fact that they were going to be in the service.
A little laid back also?
Little laid back, yes.
So now, what was your intangible that helped you with the service? Because now you're an officer.
I'm an officer.
Armor.
You know, this is something I wanted to do. I got what I wanted. I wanted to be an officer, and it was exciting.
Did they tell you that you were most likely going to end up in Vietnam at that point?
Oh, it was definite. There was no definite. I went out to Fort Lewis, Washington. I was the junior officer. There were 3 officers in each company, and within 5 months, I was what they call the Battalion S4. I was doing a captain's job because they were pulling officers out of there so fast, quickly. Sending them to Vietnam.
Is that supply, right? S4 is supply?
S4, no, was operations.
Operations, okay.
Basically operations.
Now, after Fort Lewis...
After Fort Lewis, I got my orders in September of '67. I was sent off to go to Vietnam. My first stop was in Panama Canal, for 2 weeks of jungle school. This was supposedly that we were going to engage in jungle fighting in Vietnam, so I got 2 weeks of training as far as working and living in the jungle.
Did that help you?
It was the worst 2 weeks. I tell you, Vietnam was bad, but Panama had to be the worst. What happened was we left for Panama from Fort Jackson. It was October. It was snowing. It was about 35 degrees. 7 hours later, we get down in Panama. We walk off the plane. It's 107 degrees. So it was, shall we say, the first taste of Vietnam climate and everything else.
There's an interesting story. Patton runs our first desert tank training center out in Indio, California. And when he was in North Africa with the armor, he said to him, if you keep complaining, I'm going to send you back to Indio, California, which was worse than North Africa.
Yeah.
So it's interesting, right? So sometimes those avenues aren't always
closed up. You know, you're going over paths that a lot of people go over.
So now, when you're in Panama, do they just put you outside? Is there tanks that you're working with?
No, there were no tanks. This was all infantry. We lived in what they call bohilos, which were little netted beds that they had in the woods for the first week. And the second week, we just lived in the jungle.
They had a little bit of a mosquito problem.
A little bit of a mosquito problem. I mean, it was so bad and so hot and everything else that we were taking showers in the middle of the field because that's how wet, that's how much it rained and everything down there.
Did you shed a lot of weight? Did you?
I went down. I stayed pretty much in weight. OCS gave me down to 155 pounds at that time, which was kind of, shall we say, my fighting weight. So we were only in Panama for 2 weeks, so there really wasn't that much of a time to change.
Were you glad to get out of Panama?
Definitely. Going to Vietnam.
Think of the irony of that, right?
Going to Vietnam was a pleasure from
right.
From the,
you're like, get me into this war area, or get me out of here, and I'm closer to home here, right? So, okay, it's a pretty good irony itself there, All right, so now you leave Panama.
I go to Vietnam.
South Vietnam.
Right.
What year is that?
This is 1967. This was November. I got there in November of 67.
And things are just
things
growing
were starting to roll over there. They were starting to get a lot of activity going on. When I got there, I was given an armored cav platoon. I was cavalry, so I had 7 armored personnel carriers and 3 tanks and about 50 men in my platoon. I did a lot of operations with just my platoon where I would go out where I would be the only unit going out on a patrol or something else like that. And it's funny, I was in Vietnam for about 2 weeks and my unit was put on alert. If you remember, 67 was the 7-day war in Israel.
Yep.
My unit they were actually considering pulling us out of Vietnam and sending us to Israel, which I'm glad they didn't do.
It's amazing. And it goes to show you how tied we were to other areas of the world.
Yeah.
We still have troops in Korea, Japan, Germany. Cold War's going on. Now you have more fighting between the Arab nations and Israelis.
And they were actually, they were looking for armored units, and I was an armored unit, so they were going to pull us out. We were on for about 2 weeks. We were on alert that they were actually going to send us to Israel.
So imagine that. You go from Panama to South Vietnam, then to the deserts of the Middle East.
Right, yeah. That would have been... I'm glad they didn't send us there.
Sure. Yeah. Okay, so now I have this question to ask you. You're an armor officer.
Yes.
Were you responsible to know the mechanical things behind the running of the tanks?
I went to what they call the Armor AIT. I spent 8 weeks after basic training, so I had a little bit of input into it. Plus, before I got when I went to Fort Hood, I had about 2 months where, before my orders came in for Fort Knox, and I actually spent it working in the motor pool down in Fort Hood, working on armored vehicles. So I got a taste before I even got to Fort Knox.
Did you have some good NCOs that you counted on?
Definitely. They talk about second lieutenants and everything else. And fortunately, I was smart enough to listen. I had a good top sergeant who kind of took me aside and said, hey, these are the guys that know what's going on. Listen to them. And I did. And that was very beneficial.
The backbone of the...
Well, these guys they were a little bit older. When I got to Nam, I was 22. But these guys were a little bit older, had 5, 6, some of them had 5, 6, even 10 years. In fact, my platoon sergeant was actually in Korea. So these guys had the experience, and there's nothing that beats experience.
Were some of those guys in country a little bit longer than you? That they were
some
already
of them were
there?
Yeah. Some of them were there. When I got there, my platoon, I had a platoon sergeant and 2 NCOs that were there. I had 2 that weren't in the service as long as I was, but the other ones were very helpful.
You think of armor, open country, in the middle of a desert, driving across France during World War II, right? Just some of the pictures, right, over the years. But then you think of armor in Southeast Asia.
Well,
it's not necessarily always the same.
It's not
picture,
always
right?
the same. There were a lot of jungles in there. Many of my operations were, shall we say, from a place called Chu Lai, heading towards the water. So we were in flat ground. So we were in more open ground.
What part of the country was that?
This was in I Corps. This was about 50 miles south of Da Nang.
Okay.
So it's in the northern part of Vietnam.
And that would be right on the coast there.
Right on the coast. We were right on the coast. Yes.
Now, what would some of your responsibilities be? What would be?
I would go out. My platoon. I would take my platoon and go out on a search and destroy. There would be rumors of Viet Cong being in an area. We go in looking for them, searching villages, looking for tunnels or anything else. So most of the times, many of my operations were just with my platoon.
Did you have any engineers along with you? Or?
No, we had the guys might know it. Maybe the sergeants might have a little bit, but we had no basic engineers.
So if you came across something suspicious like a tunnel, then you'd have to call
Well,
others
if we
in?
have a tunnel, we'd have once in a while, we'd have one or two of the guys that would become tunnel rats and take a trip down into it.
Now, what could you describe a tunnel rat as in terms of, for somebody watching this?
Okay, somebody is a tunnel rat. Usually was a smaller individual. The tunnels were smaller. And he was a brave son of a gun. I mean, this guy is going to go down into a tunnel, most likely with just a flashlight and a 45, and go looking for the enemy. And God knows what he would find in there. I mean, it was dangerous and everything else. And a lot of times when we were around, the people would leave or move away from the tunnels. So may not be used, but they went down into these things, crawling around inside them, and it was amazing.
And it was a whole cultural below ground.
There was a whole culture. You see a lot of the shows where they have hospitals and everything. They had all of this underneath there. We didn't run into any of them in the area that I was in because we were near the coast, and it wasn't too deep. The water was there, so it wasn't too deep.
So now you're in Vietnam. You're with the armor. What were some of the things that the enemy tried to do to disrupt your movements? Well, in terms of being in the armor itself there?
One of the main things was mines. Where I was, there was a lot of problem with landmines. We were on an operation. We were going back to base camp, and I had my platoon I was leading. This was one of the times we were on a major operation. And we were going back, and what happened is we saw a dud bomb, a 500-pound bomb that had not gone off. So what I did is I sent one of my tracks over there to blow it up. When they got over there, they opened it up, and they found that all of the explosives inside were gone.
Now, how do they blow it up?
They put some C4, which is a plastic explosive, on it and just set it off. But when they got there, they found out that the bomb was empty. So what happened is Charlie had taken all the guts out of it and was going to use it for a landmine. Unfortunately, we went down about half a click, and that same track hit a landmine. Now, you got to understand, the track weighs 12 tons. And this track hit a landmine. It blew the track 30 feet in the air. Wow. 2 guys were killed, and the other 3 who were like sitting on the outside were blown off. But it was from the 500-pound bomb. It blew the track 30 feet into the air. And
how long did you serve with those guys for? You know, they got hit. Some of them were killed.
Some of them were killed. In fact, you know, being an officer, it's hard. You don't communicate. You communicate, but you can't socialize with all of the guys because you had to maintain command over them. Yeah. And it was funny. I had one friend. His name was Leslie Matchett, and he was the track commander, and he was one of them that got killed. So it was like my only friend that I made in Vietnam of the enlisted men, and he was one of them that got killed.
Yeah, because you can't be alone, but you also have to have that discipline.
Yeah, you have to maintain the separation in order to command it. I mean, anybody got a package or something, and we all shared and everything. We shared our mail and our stories, but at the same time, you still had to maintain a certain amount of distance because you were in command and you had to give the orders.
When you were in the field and your family sent you, what was something that they sent you that...
My mother was Italian. We're Italian, so the provolone and the salami came in the packages, and you could tell the package when it came in because by the time it got to it, it might have smelled a little bit. Sure. But we shared that, you know, the provolone and the salami and everything else that she put in there. She made some very good packages.
The guys from down south and out west didn't know what kind of delicacy
they don't know, but right? They sure did share in it.
Oh, they loved it, right?
Yeah.
Okay. And how were you able to communicate with your family? You were able to write?
You were able to write. What happened is you were able to call home, but calling home was a difficulty. I wanted to call home, so I went down to make an appointment to call home, and I had to mail I was married at the time, mail my wife a letter saying that next Friday at 9 o'clock or whatever the time is, I would be trying to call you. And I would wait that week and a half. I would go in there, and they would make the call.
That'd be difficult to be married, to be in a combat position, to be an officer. You have responsibilities coming at you from every direction.
Yeah,
not an easy.
No, it's not an easy situation.
Okay. Now, you're up at Da Nang. Was that the only place that you kind of served at?
I was south of Da Nang, about 50 miles south of Da Nang. That was pretty much the only area that I worked in. I took helicopter flights down to some of the other bases. When I got back, I spent 6 months out in the field. Then I went to division headquarters. I was the security officer for the division.
Were you glad to get out of the field or do something different?
No, I was happy to get out. I went from combat situation to a rear area. Well, it wasn't rear area, but it was a back area. There was a PX there. There was an officer.
Is that Saigon?
No, that was in Chu Lai.
Where's that near?
Chu Lai is, again, about 60 miles south of Da Nang.
Wow.
Chu Lai is right on the
coast?
Right on the coast, and it was fantastic. They had a beach there, and the beach was beautiful. In fact, I know for a fact that there's a 5-star hotel that's on that beach right now.
Were you able to do some R&R? Were you able to get out of South Vietnam?
I went on R&R. I was married, so I went to Hawaii. You get 6 days to go to Hawaii, and I met my wife in Hawaii. And it's funny, it was the week that Kennedy was shot in the hotel. And I wanted to have fun, and I guess we were watching television a little bit because that was the week that Kennedy was shot.
Robert F. Kennedy,
yeah.
Right? Yeah. Now, even from Vietnam to Hawaii is a long trip.
Yeah, it's about a 12-hour flight. You make a couple of stops going back, but it's about a 12-hour flight.
Now, you hear Kennedy shot, you're in uniform. What was that feeling?
There was really nothing you could do. I mean, this is something we just saw the newscast that was going on. I mean, I was already in a war. What were they going to do to me at this point?
And that was what, 1968?
This was 1968. This was June of 68.
And now when does Tet start? Or did Tet start at the point?
Tet was January 30th of 68. I was involved in the Tet counteroffensive. But that was January of 68.
So you were really in country towards the start and really the middle of the war
When I was
itself.
in country, 67 and 68 were the main years of our buildup. Johnson built it up quite rapidly at that time. There was close to 700,000 men in Vietnam at that time.
Now, being with the headquarters, and you make it through Tet,
yeah.
How did you look at war differently after seeing the Tet operations of the enemy?
You don't look at it differently. I mean, you're still getting rocketed at night. You still have the potential. You can't really go out into the villages because you don't know what's going on. So you really don't get a different opinion about it until when you come home.
Now, did you see at Tet that they were a little bit more aggressive or a little more pinpoint with their attacks?
Tet was a 3-day battle. What happened was when it started, I was in base camp, and they attacked us on and off for 3 days. These were sappers and everything else trying to come in and set explosives, and people trying to come through the wires. So where I was, we were 3 days of fights, going back and forth. Scraps them trying to get in, us shooting them, getting rocketed, and everything else for 3 days straight.
Amazing, right? Did you feel as though that the enemy had a good idea of what they wanted to accomplish?
Not really. No, you got to understand, we're on the low level. We don't really get all the info that everything is going on. I mean, we could look at the news and everything, but that wasn't always true. So you really don't know down to my level. You really don't have all of the information. The uppers, the generals and everything else had all the information, but we really didn't have all of that basic information.
What was one of the things that you took away from working with the headquarters?
With headquarters, that men were expendable. You see the men coming and going. You see
almost just like numbers.
Almost
right?
just like numbers and everything else. And so really, when I was with headquarters, I got to work. What happened is I got to work with a lot of the Vietnamese. I was responsible for all of the Vietnamese that worked on the base.
What's that, Arvin? Is that
no, not the soldiers. Even the civilians that were coming in onto the base that picked up the garbage and took care of the main things. And so I got to meet some of them, and I did get to talk to some of the Vietnamese civilians as opposed to the Arvins or the army people.
And they were pleased that you were there?
Oh, they loved it. I mean, it's funny. They were working. Their pay was 80 cents a day, 80 PSs, which became 80 cents a day. Wow. And they were happy for the work.
Okay, we're going to come back, if it's okay, for a second episode.
Whatever you want.
With Lieutenant Dan Guida of the Armor here at HMTV. Please join us for his upcoming episode.